You ever just want to smack a motherfucker across the face? I know for a fact that you have. Why? Because I want to smack a motherfucker in the face on a weekly basis. Everyone watching this has the urge to, if not on a daily basis. In today's commentary, we'll be examining the work of Robert Greene and Mark Manson to give us the tactics and mindset to deal with other people's shit without smacking them across the face. In the spirit of the subtle art of not giving a fuck, I am leaving the swears uncensored in this episode because I don't give a flying fuck. AdSense can keep their shitty $5 in ad revenue. Now, before we dive into the Laws of Human Nature by Robert Greene, I wanted to address a potential paradox and source of confusion, particularly for those of you who are more spiritual leaning. Some mentors may tell you to look more inward, and others will tell you to look outward. And don't these contradict each other? And at first glance, it can appear that way. However, when a spiritual mentor is saying to look inward, they are referring to finding a sense of satisfaction internally, instead of blaming circumstances and themselves for your suffering. When Greene is saying to look outward, he is referring to noticing your surroundings and other people, instead of neurotically getting stuck in your own head. The two are not mutually exclusive, and in fact, as we'll see towards the end of the segment, looking outward can be incredibly spiritual as well. For better or worse, we perceive the world through and most strongly identify with our own personal perspective. The downside of this is that we often get so caught up in our own self-interest that it prevents us from empathizing with others and their needs and perspective. Greene suggests that we transform our narcissism into empathy. In a healthy person's development, they receive a healthy degree of affection from those around them, which leads to a positive self-esteem. A narcissist lacks an internal sense of self-worth, and so they depend on the affection of other people. This can be especially dangerous if they are in a position of power over others, such as the head of a company or even a nation. Narcissists are rare, but the damage they can inflict is disproportionate. Although the rest of us may not be narcissists in a clinical sense, we certainly have our moments. Greene points out that, quote, we're all on the spectrum of self-absorption. We can correct these self-absorbed tendencies by looking outward into the world and building our relationships with others. The self-absorption that Greene speaks of has been on the rise for the youth since the 70s and has become even more steep since the 2000s. To learn more about why this is the case, I suggest you give my video examining if Gen Z is really the worst generation. Greene and Haidt both argue that a likely factor is this goddamn technology. Although I'm no Luddite, it's hard to argue that sticking young people behind a screen for extended periods of time hasn't harmed their social development in some way. I myself spent a great deal of time on the screen in high school and have only really started to put myself out there and get out of my shell in the past few years. Greene argues that to build empathy is a skill. To assume we can read the intentions of others is erroneous. We must instead acknowledge that our assumptions toward other people's motives are quite poor. Do not assume that people are like you. In fact, Greene instead suggests to think of other people as you would an undiscovered territory. Developing empathy and close observation will allow you to no longer be fooled by the masks that other people present to the world. This empathic mindset gives people the same indulgence that we give ourselves. By gauging their physical features, eye contact, fidgeting, etc., you can see if someone is really paying attention to you. Inversely, you can do the same to give your full attention. A physical empathy can be used to build rapport with someone, such as mirroring a similar pose, facial expression, or even actions like sipping a drink of water at the same time. If someone is mirroring your actions, it is likely that you've built rapport with them. Analytical empathy must be implemented as well to have a more well-rounded understanding of someone. This helps us get into their head and understand their values. As Abe Lincoln once said, if you don't like someone, it's an opportunity to get to know them. Quote, I don't like that man. I must get to know him better. We all have a mask we present to the world, whether it's through being confident, humble, or hardworking. However, there are some observable cracks in the mask of perfection that we attempt to uphold. A few of these cracks can be seen in the form of microexpressions, vocal tone, and body language. At the age of 17, Milton Erickson, a future innovator in hypnotherapy, became paralyzed. However, he was able to pay extraordinary attention to people's body language and vocal tone. He noticed that there are 16 ways people can say no, including their facial expressions, even if the person is saying yes through their words. Eventually, he was able to focus his mind enough on a part of his leg, which would twitch. He was then able to stand, make small walks, and total movement came back to him. He became fascinated with the interplay of mind and body, which we have such little awareness of. Typically, psychiatrists would only use words. Instead, Erickson would notice tone, posture, body language, etc., which would lead to an exploration of nonverbal communication. In one patient, he could even tell she was having an affair because of her body language. To become more aware of body language and nonverbal cues, put the effort into noticing them when interacting with other people. While you're listening to what they're saying, also pay attention to their eyes, pose, facial expressions, etc. If you'd like to learn more about learning about body language, I suggest giving Joe Navarro's book on the subject a read. Quote, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, which is amusing to consider because cross-dressing was quite prevalent in theater at the time. Most of us would like to think that our interactions are genuine. However, we often conceal what we really think to an amazing degree. Imagine someone who blurted out everything that they really thought without any regard for the feelings of others. Greene gives us two things we must do upon realizing that human society is an act. The first is to accept this theatrical quality of life, as opposed to moralizing or ranting against it. And the other is to be aware when others are acting, to read the feelings of others, and to not be deceived by their words. This explains the phenomena of mixed signals. Someone says one thing to you, but in fact does another. To determine what someone is really thinking with those mixed signals, Greene instructs us to look at their behavior, their body language, gestures, microexpressions, etc., which provide far more information. For instance, you tell someone something, and they roll their eyes quickly, but try to hide it with a smile. Coming back to self-interest, we all have our own agenda. This is why we get defensive when someone is trying to persuade us of something. To get someone to do something that you want, it must come of their free will. That's where the idea of getting people to do what you want by making it seem like it was their idea comes from. We have a guard against the world as we are judged and praised. At the same time we are doing this, however, we seek validation ourselves. Some implicit self-opinions are, I am a good person, I am intelligent, I am attractive, etc. After all, who wants to be told that they are an immoral, unattractive dumbass? Self-opinion often violates our own opinion of ourselves. We will view ourselves as competent and intelligent while being harsh and critical toward others. For instance, there can be a circumstance in which we say something is not our fault. However, if someone else was in the exact same situation, we would blame them. Instead of validating our own opinions and values, we must understand and validate the values of others. Quote, In this case, you are fulfilling one of people's greatest emotional needs. We can imagine that we are independent, intelligent, decent, and self-reliant, but only other people can truly confirm this for us. And in a harsh and competitive world in which we are all prone to continual self-doubt, we almost never get this validation that we crave. When you give it to people, you will have the magical effect that occurred when you yourself were drunk, or at a rally, or in love. Your task is simple. Instill in people a feeling of inner security. Mirror their values. Show that you like and respect them. Make them feel you appreciate their wisdom and experience. Generate an atmosphere of mutual warmth. Get them to laugh along with you, instilling a feeling of rapport. All of this works best if the feelings are not completely faked. By exercising your empathy, by getting inside their perspective, you are more likely to genuinely feel at least part of such emotions. Practicing this often enough and confirming people's self-opinion will become your default position. You will have a loosening effect on almost everyone you encounter. If someone has a low self-opinion, praising them or saying that something is good for them won't work, because they expect things to go badly. Greene suggests we instead mirror their sense of injustice to give them a sense of invalidation. So how do we persuade people? The first way is to become a highly focused listener. When in a conversation with someone, while listening to someone else, we are typically thinking of what we are going to say next instead of listening to what the other person has to say. Quote, "The usual prescription is to talk less and listen more. But this is meaningless advice as long as we prefer our own internal monologue." The person who is doing the listening has more control because they are the ones gathering information. This is not about asking questions like a job interview, but paying close attention to their thoughts, as well as nonverbal cues. Next, we have mood. As social creatures, we are susceptible to the nonverbal cues of others. So the next time you want to influence someone, pop a molly and get a rave going. Adobe After Effects abuse aside, our mood can highly affect the moods of others. If someone is confident, at ease, and speaks at a reasonable pace, we are more likely to listen to them than someone who's coked up or looks like they want to blow their brains out. Mood affects our ability to influence others. Our ability to internally cultivate peace, confidence, and joy will determine our ability to influence externally. We all have insecurities about our appearance, our masculinity, femininity, or whatever the hell, our competence, etc. The phrase "flattery gets you nowhere" is half true. If someone feels they are awful at something, then flattery, in fact, gets you nowhere. But if someone is not sure about how skilled they are at something, flattery may be more effective. Complimenting someone's effort is more effective than their talent. Praise can be also mixed with constructive criticism. I love the sound you put out on SoundCloud, but the build-up could use a little bit more attention. There is also more wiggle room for flattery with people who are your equals, such as your peers and coworkers. With your superiors, however, it is better to validate their 2 cents. There's more than a few people out there who are resistant to any kind of influence. They oppose anything that anyone suggests and feel that the world is against them. I know that I've felt that way on a few occasions. A way to counter this is to use a bit of judo. In judo, you use the energy of your opponent rather than imposing your own. How does this apply to influencing someone? We have to understand someone else's point of view and what they value. Greene gives another example of the therapist Milton Erickson, who had a patient on the brink of divorce. The married couple was on their honeymoon, but when it was time for sexy time, they were rather awkward due to their religious upbringing. Erickson suggested that they have one last friendly evening, a last friendly glass of champagne, a friendly last kiss between them. And sure enough, they decided to stay together so that they could have friendly time all the time. Greene gives another example of the son of a pawnbroker who couldn't convince his dad to convert to Buddhism. A Zen master would pay the pawnbroker to do the prayers, and this seemed like a good deal. He'd get some money and get his son to shut up. However, one day the Zen master didn't show up, and the pawnbroker was too busy chanting to notice. The pawnbroker then became a donor to the temple. People who are immune to influence are afraid of change. The more you try to encourage them, the more stubborn they become. A trap here is to project and say how everyone else is immune to influence except ourselves. We have to admit that there are times we do this, and that it hinders our ability to be creative. Even Socrates was wise because he was aware of his own ignorance. Greene suggests a healthy irony from our self-opinion. We are not as incredible as the idealized versions we have of ourselves, or the self-loathing image to the contrary. We can be selfish and obsessed with our own self-agenda just as much as everyone else, if not more so. By being aware of this, we can dissolve any inner insecurities and truly be of service to others. As social creatures, for better or worse, we are constantly comparing ourselves to other people. We are constantly comparing our possessions and status to others. We must be conscious of our envy of others, in others, but most importantly, ourselves. To dissolve envy in ourselves, we must derive our self-worth from our own standards, instead of comparing ourselves to those around us. Envy from others can come in the form of eagerness or subtle jabs. Such can be summed up in a quote by Gura. Quote, "Every time a friend succeeds, I die a little." Envy is dangerous because it almost is never explicitly expressed. We must decode where this envy may be coming from to understand it and prevent arousing envy in others. To learn more about envy, Contrapoints has a fantastic video about the subject, which I will put in the description. Some signs of envy are microexpressions, poisonous praise, backbiting, and push and pull. With microexpressions, a way to test envy is to tell someone when something good has happened to you, and to just notice how their face responds. If they look upset for a half a second or so, they are likely envious. Poisonous praise is when someone gives you praise, but it's directed in a superficial way. It's directed at the fruits, the viewership, the riches, etc., and not the process of the work itself. Assuming that your only motive was status or profit, etc. Backbiting is gossip, as the saying goes. If someone is gossiping about other people, they are likely gossiping about you. Another saying people say is not to say anything you wouldn't say to another's face. However, a more precise way of looking at this is to not say anything you wouldn't want repeated to them. You may very well say something to someone's face, but it would not be taken well if repeated by someone else. Push-pull is the alternating between the pleasure of giving you warmth and affection that pulls you in, and the push of inflicting pain and withdrawing from you. Greene also has a few categories for those who are envious. The self-entitled slacker, someone who expects things to be handed to them but is not willing to put in the effort. the leveler, someone who will put down the powerful and pretentious. However, these types can be envious of your success and sabotage you in the name of justice. The status friend, someone who is around you only because of your success, asking you how much money you're making or any shiny objects you may have so that they can have brownie points by latching themselves onto you or someone else. And last, we have the insecure master, who is insecure of the success of his prodigies. How do we deal with envy triggers? Be aware of who you are praising. Will this make them jealous? Quote, if you have any natural gifts that elevate you above others, you must be aware of the dangers and avoid flaunting such talents. Instead, you want to strategically reveal some flaws to blunt people's envy and mask your natural superiority. If you are gifted in the sciences, make it clear to others how you wish you had more social skills. Show your intellectual clumsiness at subjects outside your expertise. Envy is now more pervasive than ever due to social media. This limited view into the lives of those around us, presents only the most incredible highlights. You might see the beautiful vacation in Maui, but you don't see the stupid fights and petty bullshit behind the scenes that went on. When feeling envious, we must understand things in context. Someone may have more than us in that moment, but we are completely unaware of what the rest of their life is really like. We can also be grateful and acknowledge what we have, particularly if we are blessed to have a roof over our head, plenty to eat, access to the internet, compared to others who may not have the access and opportunities that we have. Lastly, we must turn envy to emulation, having confidence in our own success and skills instead of leveling those who are more talented than us. Quote, your self-worth comes from within, not from without. Don't envy greatness. Admire it. From our perspective, we tend to think that we're hot shit. This confirmation bias is further confirmed by any success we may have, no matter how small. Delusions of grandeur are dangerous not only for those who are possessed by them, but those around them as well. To avoid this, Greene recommends your sense of greatness be tied to what you have already achieved and, more importantly, what you are actually currently working on, not fantastical pipe dreams. Greene gives the example of Michael Eisner, former CEO of Disney. Eisner had success at ABC and Paramount and became CEO in 1984. It hadn't had much success in a while, and under Eisner, Disney became the most successful studio around. However, when creating a park in France, it wasn't as successful because Eisner did not have proper expectations or familiarity with French customs. As a result, there was half the turnout as expected. We need to have proper expectations and familiarity with things to be successful. If we make assumptions toward that which we are not familiar, another culture, the market, other people, people's tastes and preferences, etc., we get ourselves screwed. Eisner also felt another perceived threat, Jeffrey Katzenberg, who was behind the revitalization of Disney's animation department. He's responsible for quite a few animated films that my generation has seen and grew up with, such as Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, and The Lion King. Now, Eisner fired Katzenberg because he was jealous that he was after his position, or so he thought. Katzenberg didn't go down without a fight, however. He sued and got his bonus and tried to get him to agree to $90 million. Eisner changed his mind at the last minute because he didn't think he owed him anything. The judge, however, ruled in Katzenberg's favor, and Disney had to pay $280 million. That's how much having an ego can cost you. Katzenberg would also go on to co-found a new studio, DreamWorks. Oh, now I get that South Park reference.
You aren't ruining on, DreamWorks.
We better wear those purity rings so we can sell sex to their... But wait, that's not all. Steve Jobs, CEO of Pixar, also had beef with Eisner and his micromanaging. Eisner had so much beef that I bet you could end world hunger with it. And eventually, Roy Disney himself had enough. And the whole board had enough of Eisner's Baconator beef. This shareholder revolt was known as Save Disney, and as a result, Eisner stepped down in 2005, keeping all the Baconator beef to himself. So what can we learn from Eisner and his beefy egotism? We must not get complacent or deluded, but instead have an honest view of other factors that play into our success. Were there fortunate circumstances? Who helped us and contributed? Who was a mentor to us? Who was a mentor to us? Quote, compensate for the drug-like effect of success by keeping our feet planted firmly in the ground. The gods are merciless with those who fly too high on the wings of grandiosity, and they will make you pay the price. Getting what you want is rarely easy. Success will depend on a lot of effort and some luck. To make your project work, you will probably have to jettison your previous strategy circumstances. Circumstances are always changing, and you need to keep an open mind. The people you are trying to reach never respond exactly as you might have imagined or hoped. In fact, people will generally surprise and frustrate you in their reactions. They have their own needs, experiences, and particular psychology that are different from your own. To impress your targets, you'll have to focus on them and their spirit. If you fail to accomplish what you want, you will have to examine carefully what you did wrong and strive to learn from experience. Grandiosity is a problem for us because it alters our sense of proportion. We can have some highly ambitious tasks, some vast distance to conquer, but if we see the space from A to Z as smaller than it really is, perhaps we believe, everyone will love our revolutionary idea and will get praise for it. And if it doesn't work out, this results in resentment and blame. Typically, we attribute delusions of grandeur to celebrities, but it can also be found in anyone who is influential in some way. Grandiosity is so pernicious because it alters our perception of reality itself. This makes it difficult to assess things accurately. Quote, you are rarely aware of your own grandiosity because, by its nature, it alters your perception of reality and makes it hard to have an accurate assessment of yourself. Now, there's a few contributors to having grandiosity. The first is that someone had an experience of greatness when they were younger, and so they maintain that need for validation when they get older. Greene argues that another is the access to skills on the internet, because information is so easily available. We assume if we are good at writing, for instance, that we could make the next great film, whereas true mastery takes years, if not decades. Greene makes a distinction between practical grandiosity and fantastical grandiosity. It is in our nature to have ambitious goals. The issue is not striving for greatness, but thinking that we ourselves are, quote, superior than is actually the case. Fantastical grandiosity is delusional and based on any attention or validation we feel entitled to. Practical grandiosity is patient, strategic, and its satisfaction comes from the work itself, and the attention of others is not necessary for validation. We must come to terms with our grandiosity instead of suppressing it. This requires self-awareness. The grandiose energy must be channeled in some way. Even if your passion is not your job, it's not the hours you put in per se, but the consistency and intensity put into it. See my episode on how to focus to organize your time and become consistently productive. Link is in the description. One thing I've learned over the years is how quickly ideas can be generated compared to their implementation. Something may be a great idea on paper, but we must be practical about how long it would actually take to implement, how much energy and resources it would take for it to be more than just another great idea on paper. This is why it can be best to be careful about who you tell your ideas to. Not because they'll steal them per se, but chances are the person just won't give a shit about it. And this can be a bit discouraging. If someone stole your idea, at least that would be validation that your idea was valuable. I've learned that the universe can pretty much wipe its ass with any great idea I may have. We may have something tangible to present. That is when we can ask for feedback and constructive criticism. Create calibrated challenges where you can pick a project you feel confident in doing and will be a little bit of a struggle, and you keep picking gradually more and more difficult projects. For instance, if you go to yoga class, you may start with restorative, then vinyasa, then power, then hot power, and those crazy poses that astonish me every time I see them. I recommend Leo Gura's episode on setting proper expectations to have a mindset closer to the practical grandiosity that Greene describes. Quote, "Madness is something rare in individuals, but in groups, parties, peoples, and ages, it is the rule." Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, because I am the eternal contrarian, I've always had a disdain for groupthink, almost to a fault. Okay, to a fault. I've always had contempt for popular music, sports, fashion, and all that trendy pop culture bullshit. Do the opposite of what the mainstream is doing no matter what. But isn't being a contrarian still conforming to the group? You know what? Just do whatever you like, man. Subtle art of not giving a fuck. For better or worse, we are social creatures, and we have a need to fit in, whether it be in a corporate boardroom or a local goth scene. We conform to a group not only by adopting its appearance, but its ideas as well. Initially, we may agree with the ideas of a group in a general sense, but have our own unique take on it. That being said, we must also be aware of our performance in the group. If we deviate from or dishonor their values, it will reflect poorly on us. Be aware of language or ideas someone may find offensive based on their values. It doesn't mean that you have to change how you think or feel, but if you fully understand their values, it can actually be of great strategic strength. However, in more extreme examples, a group may act in horribly unethical ways, but expect you to comply. In such cases, your rationality is a great asset to protect yourself. Feel free to check out my video on cults, which is an excerpt from Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power, titled How to Create a Cult in 5 Easy Steps. Groupthink can also come in the form of hyping some great opportunity. All you have to do is invest your hard-earned cash into it, and you will become rich. Think Elon Musk rich, Jeff Bezos rich. You'll be so rich that you'll never have to wipe your ass again. All if you invest in the right. We need to ask ourselves, quote, how is this valuable? How does this work? Is everything I'm told really true? Take the recent case of Elizabeth Holmes, for instance. Not only did she convince others that she had a deep voice.
No, it hasn't. Well, if I use traditional words to describe what we're doing, it's hard because people then associate it with conventional processes.
She also tricked some of the most powerful people in the world into investing in a machine that didn't even fucking work. Just because a powerful group, or at least appears to be powerful, or company is pitching something to you, doesn't necessarily mean that you should join in on the bandwagon. Different companies or cultures also have different customs that we should be aware of. Typically, we assume that other people think and act the way that we do. When working with any group, we should instead be curious about their perspective and what they value. Are they more liberal or progressive? Are they more conservative? Are they hierarchical or more cooperation oriented? What do they find offensive, etc.? Any system has what is called homeostasis, making it even more difficult to challenge. This is why someone who is highly idealistic and wants to change a political or cultural system is likely to become corrupted by that system. Understanding a group's values can also give you success in its ranks. Most people in a group will use flattery to position themselves closer to the leader, hence the term brown-nosing. Instead, use indirect flattery. If everyone is complimenting the leader on their achievements, converse with them about their cultural tastes to build rapport. If the group has an enemy, seem open to hearing the group's issues with them, but be careful about openly expressing skepticism. Groups often split into factions where differences are irreconcilable. These differences can be personal, ideological, or both. A potential problem with conforming to a group is that you may have to sacrifice your own individuality. If you completely conform to the group, you may lose your own uniqueness. However, if you differ too much from the group, it may sacrifice your position. Groups tend to praise their own ideas while demonizing their real or perceived enemies. This is because tribalism is a very powerful force within our nature, which makes us susceptible to beliefs such as all white people are racist or trust the plan. To do this, the group must all share a common purpose, competent leadership at all levels of the group, free flowing of information and ideas, knowledge of everyone's strengths and weaknesses, and positive emotions. Trust is something earned, especially in the case of leadership. Try to get 10 people together to do anything. Well, let's make it a little bit easier. 5 people. Try and get 5 people together to do anything, even something fun, like going out for a night or seeing a local band. So what do we have to do that? We have to match everybody's schedules, coordinate logistics, etc. It's a fucking hassle to get 5 Nimrods to do anything. What an abysmal fucking hassle it must be to lead an organization, a company, a state, or a nation. To get anyone on board with anything, we must prove what we can provide for them and earn their trust.
And then you'll know for sure that you finally found a broker on Wall Street that you can trust.
We must be mindful of the effect we have on others. We must learn to project authority, as well as the downfalls of previous authority figures. So, how do we establish our authority?
I am a cop, and you will respect my authority.
There's a number of ways to build your authority. One is authenticity. The founder, the visionary artist, truth seeker, healer, and teacher. Look outwardly. Listen to those around you. By listening to the needs of others, you can sense what they are missing, and thus what you can offer. Quote, you absorb yourself in the work, not your ego. Lead from the front. Work harder than everyone else, or at least appear to. This will make everyone aspire to be as productive as you are. Be tough but fair. Create more value than you take, but don't overpromise. Be flexible to avoid rigidity and stagnation. To cultivate our inner authority, Greene writes that we have a responsibility to contribute to the larger culture that we are a part of. Countless people before us improved the world through many struggles we no longer have to face. To contribute and serve this purpose, we must discover and develop what is unique about ourselves. To develop our unique gifts, we must focus and embody the highest standards of our work. We all have our own way of looking at the world, and this not only affects our perception of the world, but what actually happens to us as well. We may not have control over what happens to us, but we do have control over our attitude toward what happens to us. Quote, by making our attitude more positive, open, and tolerant of other people, we can spark a different dynamic. We can learn from adversity, create opportunities out of nothing, and draw people to us. We must explore the limits of our willpower and how far it can take us. We like to assume that we all experience reality in the same way, and that there is some objective logic to reality. However, this is an absurd assumption. No two people experience reality the same way, or even have the exact same values. Unless they're all NPCs, of course. Jung called this lens in which we perceive the world our attitude. If we are blinded by negativity, this hinders our ability to connect with others, and thus any opportunity that may come our way. Greene writes that this comes from negative experiences in childhood. Being negative is a defense mechanism to protect us from the fear of uncertainty. From what Greene calls the constricted attitude, one bears no responsibility and is only a victim of others and circumstances. Here are a few forms of the constricted attitude. The hostile attitude. Someone has some form of trauma that makes them perceive the world as hostile. In turn, they become hostile to maintain a sense of self-control, and this confirms their view of the world. In the context of a romantic relationship, someone could believe that their partner doesn't love them enough. If the other person is defensive, this confirms their limiting beliefs. If they are silent, this also confirms their view. The anxious attitude. Anxious types expect obstacles no matter what the circumstance is. In the workplace, they are notorious micromanagers, which eventually bites them in the ass. An example of this was a feud between FDR's wife, Eleanor, and his mother. FDR's mom wanted to keep him isolated to treat his polio, which would force him to give up his political career. Eleanor, however, knew that what he needed was a gradual return to his old life. Eventually, Eleanor won this feud. FDR's mom was masking her anxiety and need to control as concern. If you notice anxious tendencies in yourself, Greene suggests to put your energy into work to take some of the edge off. If someone else is anxious, be the calming force that they are lacking. The avoidant attitude. The avoidant attitude is due to doubts and insecurities toward one's own abilities. As they get older, this perception turns into the avoidance of responsibilities and challenges. This is to avoid any circumstance in which they would find themselves subject to criticism or disappointment of others. The resentful attitude. Greene describes the resentful type as lacking love and affection as children, and so they resent others as adults. When they see that others have more than them, they see this as a form of injustice. Resentful leaders rally and come to power through the collective resentment of others. This pretty much explains the phenomena of SJWs, of all ideological shades and persuasions. The expansive attitude. Doctors once thought that to solve a specific ailment of the body meant fixing it in an isolated, fragmented way. However, the health of the body is dependent on the health of all of its parts. Similarly, it is our overall mindset, as opposed to just our individual problems we face, that determine our ability to be fulfilled. So how do we view the world in a more positive way?
Find the positive, but do that. Focus on the good. Focus on the good.
Greene describes this way of looking at the world as being like an explorer. Most of us, by the age of 30, or maybe even younger, have assumptions about the world, and that we don't need to learn anything else. Whereas the person with the expansive view is always eager to learn and explore new ideas. This way of viewing the world gives incredible mental pleasure and creative power, even when life isn't exactly peaches and cream. There will inevitably be bullshit in our lives. Our natural tendency is to avoid or deny the pain we face. We must instead embrace the painful obstacles in our way. So here's a metaphor for all you yogis out there. At the beginning of a hot yoga session, we are anxious, hot, and sweaty, and the pain hasn't even begun. Then you're halfway through, sweating, crying like a little bitch. However, there comes a point where you observe and even enjoy all the sweaty suffering, being fully present as every cell of your body is just fucking killing you as you limp and whimper as the person to your left does a fucking headstand. And then it's Shavasana. You can almost feel as if you could float out of your body. And then you're back to discussing The Laws of Human Nature by Robert Greene. Typically when we are in pain or upset, we try to push it away through scrolling through Pornhub, buying shit that we don't need on Amazon, or the abysmal cancer to all things decent that is TikTok. Now, at the risk of sounding like some douchey, self-indulgent self-help guru, we need to look inward to accept and embrace our pain. This is why meditation is so powerful, because for 20 minutes of silence, we can see what is really occurring internally. This leads us to how to view the self, lowercase, not uppercase, so as to avoid confusion with the all-pervading consciousness of existence. In terms of how to view yourself in an expansive way, some of the ancients were convinced that they were descendants of the gods. It would be unhealthy and narcissistic to believe this today. Probably at that time too. However, if we believe we are destined for something great, we are more able to be resilient when faced with adversity. The expansive view of people is to see them as a force of nature, and as such, not to take things personally. This understanding will allow you to become more tolerant, and in return, people will be more open towards you. The final way Greene describes attitude is spirituality. The idea of a soul is found in all pre-modern societies. The soul is what is beyond our mind and body. It is how we perceive and experience the world. As we go about our lives, it's easy to fixate on things such as material success and all that other shit that our ego desperately craves and desires. However, a more spiritual way, and in this sense, your spirit can be your attitude, if you are more secular minded, is to see the world as if it were with fresh eyes. Quote, "You adapt to circumstances instead of complaining about them. You accept and embrace uncertainty and the unexpected as valuable qualities of life. In this way, your soul expands the contours of life itself and fills itself with this life force. Learn to measure the people you deal with by the depth of their soul, and if possible, associate as much as you can with those of the expansive variety." You could say that the best way to deal with other people's shit is to deal with your own. It's easy to get angry about the tiniest things. Realizing this makes you bitter and resentful. You get angry about the fact that you get so angry, and this escalates to the point of slamming your fist on your desk and screeching autistically to the top of your lungs. The same pattern applies to feeling anxious or depressed as well. Of course, you may watch this and think, I'm such a loser for doing that. To which Manson recommends that we take a step back and acknowledge the infinite beauty of our humanity. Of course, an influx of images of everyone being happier than a 5-year-old with a Happy Meal sure doesn't help. There is a way to short-circuit this surefire feedback loop of misery, and that is to stop giving a fuck. Now, this isn't to say that popping a Molly will magically solve all your problems. Speaking of problems, just because you live in a first world country doesn't mean that this automatically eliminates all your problems altogether. Sure, on average, we may have a pretty decent style of living, but this doesn't mean that having the latest iPhone will alleviate all of the suffering from your existence. If we chase something, the further it will get away from us. Or if we get it, the more empty we will feel. This is why there is so much emphasis on detachment in Buddhism. Now, when I first heard of this mindset, an objection that I had was that, of course, you give a shit about some things, and you have attachments to results, because you expect and desire a certain outcome, and that this is impossible to overcome as a living being. And this is where we need to be a bit nuanced, hence subtle art of not giving a fuck. Because, of course, we do in fact have expectations and attachments for certain outcomes. To deny this would be unrealistic. However, when we let go a bit and stop being so obsessive about these outcomes, this allows us to take risks and to be more present. Paradoxically, by doing this, we are more likely to get what we want in the end. Not giving a fuck allows you the freedom to pursue whatever you authentically desire, regardless of other people's expectations, or more importantly, your own. We must acknowledge when we are giving a fuck about something we really shouldn't give a fuck about. And so, a comment that upset your ego, so-and-so believes this, so-and-so likes crappy music, and so posted this on Instagram, etc. If you put your mental energy into everything, then it will seem like the world is against you. Quote. When most people envision giving no fucks whatsoever, they imagine a kind of serene indifference to everything, a calm that weathers all storms. They imagine and aspire to be a person who is shaken by nothing and caves in to no one. Typically, when we envision someone who doesn't give a fuck, we imagine someone who is indifferent to everything. There's a term for this, a psychopath. Quote, why you would want to emulate a psychopath, I have no fucking clue. Quote, subtlety number 1. Not giving a fuck doesn't mean being indifferent. It means being comfortable with being different. The subtlety of this is that the philosophy of the subtle art should not be mistaken for indifference. Quote, people who are indifferent are lame and scared. They're couch potatoes and internet trolls. Or in today's terminology, doomers. Quote, in fact, indifferent people often attempt to be indifferent because, in reality, they give way too many fucks. They give a fuck what everyone thinks of their ideas, so they hide behind sarcasm and self-righteous snark. They're afraid to let anyone get close to them, so they imagine themselves as someone special. Unique snowflakes, who has problems that nobody else would ever understand. There's no such thing as not giving a fuck about anything. We must instead prioritize what we do give a fuck about. For instance, you may have the goal of playing music on stage. You do care about practicing and giving the best performance that you can. But you do not give a fuck what your neighbors think, what your family thinks, or even what your teacher thinks. To give a more global example, let's say you care about the environment, the big picture of our planet and relationship to it. So getting into disputes about identity seems frivolous in comparison. As Carl Sagan once pointed out, carbon molecules do not give a fuck about national or ideological boundaries. Quote, this is what is so admirable. No, not me, dumbass. The overcoming adversity stuff. The willingness to be different, an outcast, a pariah. All for the sake of one's values. The willingness to stare failure in the face and shove your middle finger back at it. The people who just laugh and do what they believe in anyway. Because they know it's right. They know it's more important than they are. More important than their own feelings and own pride and their own ego. They say fuck it. Not to everything in life, but rather to everything unimportant in life. They reserve their fucks for what truly matters. And because of that, because they reserve their fucks for only the big things that matter, people give a fuck about them in return. Subtlety number 2. To not give a fuck about adversity, you must first give a fuck about something more important than adversity. If we do not have a worthwhile purpose, it is likely we will make one up. finding ourselves upset at the most trivial shit. Subtlety number 3. Whether you realize it or not, you are always choosing what to give a fuck about. When we were young, everything was novel to us. We cared about everyone and everything. It would be absurd if an adult cried at the same thing that would make them cry at age 5. As we mature, we become more selective in what we give a fuck about. Hopefully. We need to face reality, that it's okay for things to suck at times. To avoid this is a denial of reality. If we don't face this, we risk harmful coping mechanisms, like popping Xannies or soliciting. Acknowledgement of this reality is what Mark Manson calls a practical enlightenment. Not enlightenment in terms of what New Agers advertise it as being, but the realization and acceptance of suffering, pain, rejection, misery, failure, and insecurity. Manson doesn't suggest an easy fix scenario, unlike many New Age gurus, but instead the use of pain as a tool, and to transform your problems into better ones. Happiness comes from solving problems. The cessation of problems is a falsehood. They either mutate or level up. Quote, problems are a constant in life. When you solve your health problem by buying a gym membership, you create new problems, like having to get up early to get to the gym on time, sweating like a meth head for 30 minutes on an elliptical, and then getting showered and changing for work so you don't stink up the whole office. When you solve your problem of spending enough time with your partner by designating Wednesday night date night, you generate new problems, such as figuring out what to do every Wednesday that you both won't hate, making sure you have enough money for nice dinners, rediscovering the chemistry and spark you two feel you've lost, and unraveling the logistics of fucking in a small bathtub filled with too many bubbles. The act of solving problems is very satisfying, and solving problems requires action. We expect not to have problems, which makes us miserable. Some of these solutions are simple, like beating the campaign to Halo on easy, or learning to play any pop song by ear. Others are more difficult, like communication with other human beings in the workplace, playing Resident Evil Code Veronica without a walkthrough, learning a Coltrane tune by ear, or deciding whether or not to get fries on a date. A negative response to these problems can come in the form of denial, or being a victim. Manson points out that in the same way, we can be addicted to certain substances or experiences. We can also be addicted to negative states of mind, like victimhood, which explains the phenomena of call-it culture on social media. Negative feelings are a sign that there is a problem that needs to be solved. It's easy to desire pleasant things. Pretty much everyone agrees that sex, drugs, and rock and roll are pleasant experiences, unless you're an evangelical preacher from the 80s or something. Instead, Manson asks, quote, what are you willing to struggle for? Do you desire getting into peak physical shape? Well, are you willing to exercise 3 to 5 hours a week, along with planning all of your meals? Many of us want a lot of cash in our bank accounts, but would not enjoy working 80 to 100-hour work weeks, paperwork, and rigid hierarchies, and dealing with people's shit. We desire the love of our life, with passionate caresses and kisses over a sunset-lit beach, and with Sting playing in the background over a sunset sky. However, we do not enjoy bickering, faulty communication, feeling betrayed, and sending alimony checks, unless you're this guy. It's not the result that ultimately matters, but the process. And this isn't to say that we all have to have a raging hard-on for willpower, no pain, no gain. People who are successful enjoy the problems of it, be it in business, in art, or in relationships. Our internal monologue may go something like the following. I feel like shit because blah, 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 blah. I feel fucking fantastic because, in terms of stereotypes, men are viewed as having less emotional intelligence than women. The people with the dyed hair say that it's something to do with the patriarchy or something. Manson gives the story of one of my favorite musicians who was kicked out of a thrash metal band in 1983. And in the worst possible way. Without warning, he was told to pack up his shit and was given a bus ticket from New York to Los Angeles. To exact his revenge, he started a new band that would go on to release such titles as Peace Sells But Who's Buying, Hangar 18, In My Darkest Hour, Holy Wars, The Punishment Due, and Symphony of Destruction. Surely they would be the supreme metal band that would put those noobs in Metallica in their place, selling out arenas while Lars would work at McDonald's. I'm sorry. I remembered I have to avoid judgment. All musicians and songs and genres are created equal, and it's all just subjective anyways. And that musician was none other than Dave Mustaine, guitarist, songwriter, and vocalist of Megadeth, selling 25 million albums, much better than waiting tables or being a bus driver. Mustaine is hands down one of the greatest metal guitar players of all time, along with Chris Poland, Jeff Young, Marty Friedman, not that guy, and Chris Broderick. However, the band that he was kicked out of, Metallica, sold 180 million records. Their drummer couldn't even play double bass for double decades. But hey, they're called Alcoholica for a reason. Because Mustaine was comparing himself to Alcoholica, who sold more records than he did, he thought of himself as the guy who got kicked out of Metallica. Now, to most people, this sounds kind of absurd because here's someone who's making millions, getting to play what they love for a living. And, so what if he got kicked out of some new band in the 80s? He's blessed to be very successful. Most musicians can't sell a fucking thing on Bandcamp. From his perspective, though, Mustaine's success was defined by his rival, and this tormented him. This is a great example of how our perspective affects our values. Manson admits that he had the fantasy of being a rock star, but was not willing to put the energy in to write songs, put together a band, get people to show up for a fucking gig. To someone who doesn't value musicianship in the same way, Mustaine's rivalry seems quite petty. However, as someone with a little bit of insight into this, considering I've played guitar for 13 years myself, I could see why getting kicked out of a band like that and seeing them become more commercially successful than you would be extremely painful. However, as someone once remarked in a really brilliant YouTube comment, something quite rare, Mustaine getting kicked out was a blessing for us, the fans, because we got to listen to both. Except for Load and Reload, because that's exactly what those albums were, a load. By contrast, Manson gives the example of Pete Best, the OG drummer of the Beatles, who was kicked out for being too good-looking and receiving more attention than any drummer should. Apparently only people who sing or play guitar get to be the narcissists in the band. They replaced him with a guy who was a bit awkward-looking and insisted on writing about submarines and octopuses. Pusses. To tie it back to Robert Greene, that's a prime example of, quote, don't outshine the master, the first law of the 48 Laws of Power. Be aware of people's fragile egos at all times. The rest of the 60s fucking sucked for Pete Best. He attempted to kill himself, and his other musical projects were failures. In time, however, he ended up happier, got married, and still got to tour Europe and record music in the 2000s. He said that he was glad that he got fired from the Beatles, because that ultimately led him to meet his wife and have children. Now, he may not have received as much adulation as the Beatles, but at least he can say that he was a part of the Beatles, because that's what really matters. And instead of all that fame and fortune and all that shallow material crap and hookers and blow and crazy drugged up orgies and your dentist putting LSD in your coffee and women screaming for 3 hours straight while taking their tops off your tunes, and 50,000 didgeridoo and flipping over cars on PCP. Okay, we get it. Being a rock star is a lot of fun that the rest of us plebs don't get to have and never will get to have. Instead of all that endless supply of cocaine, Pete valued the things that really matter in life, like friends, family. It's not how far you walk, but how hard and determined you walk. Walk hard. Pleasure and material success are false metrics, even though they are constantly marketed to us. They are false because once our basic material needs are met, more material success isn't going to increase our happiness by that much. Another shitty value, and this is one that I struggle with sometimes, is the addiction to being right. If your metric of success is to always be right, you'll have to jump through hoops to justify all your beliefs. Being rigid in your thinking also makes it harder to learn and consider new perspectives. Positivity can also be a shitty value. As previously stated, life will always throw a fat helping of steaming shitty problems your way. Fake positivity is a form of denial. While in general it behooves us to have a positive outlook on things, denying how we really feel about something will accentuate the problem instead of fixing it. And this ties into the previous point about pursuing pleasure. We must accept a degree of frustration, pain, boredom, and just plain shit we don't want to fucking do. As that motherfucker Freud once said, one day in retrospect, the years of struggle will strike you as the most beautiful. As Uncle Ben once said to Peter Parker,
with great power comes great responsibility.
There is power when we adopt responsibility, and it is an incredibly useful tool for dealing with people's shit. Here we have to distinguish between responsibility from fault. Fault is based on the past, whereas responsibility is the acceptance of current circumstance and how to make things right for the future. Circumstances can be shitty, but your perspective on them is your responsibility. Mark Manson gives a very shocking personal example of his where his ex-girlfriend cheated on him with her teacher of all people. He confronted her about this and they split. For months he was in pain, which is to be expected. However, it occurred to him that she may have cheated on him because there were poor boundaries in the relationship. And this was a turning point for Manson. He writes it was awesome. Like getting punched in the stomach 250 times is awesome. The moral of the story is, watch out for those golf instructors. Don't trust teachers or golf instructors, or any kind of instructor for that matter.
You fucking motherfucker! And we'll see how you like it when someone fucks with your shit!
Pick yourself up by your bootstraps, even if your girlfriend fucks her teacher. Extreme ownership. By the way, if you have issues in this part of your life and dating, I highly recommend Models by Mark Manson. It's actually it's a hidden gem. It's one of the few books that I've found in this subject that actually gives sound guidance on the subject and not just cheap bullshit gimmicks. If documentaries are more your thing, we also have Why is Dating So Difficult, where Models is explored heavily in the last third. A circumstance can be shitty, completely devoid of any fault of our own or anyone else, but is still our responsibility to deal with responsibly. Like Andy. Let's take Andy from Shawshank Redemption. If you haven't seen that movie, pause or click ahead because I don't want to spoil it for you. Spoiler alert. Let's take Andy, who was accused of murdering his cheating bitch wife, but was actually innocent. After 20 years of being abused and laundering money for the head of the prison, he made life better for prisoners. Being denied a retrial, Andy used a rock hammer to escape over years. He crawled through half a mile of shit-filled crawl space. Talk about people dealing with people's shit, literally, getting a new identity and moving to Mexico. Now, if that isn't adopting personal responsibility, I don't know what is. However, extreme ownership, as Jocko Willink would call it, isn't very fashionable or trendy. So, what is fashionable? What gets all the views? What gets all the views? What gets all the viewership? I need to know. Our addiction to being right, and therefore our addiction to being a victim. Our addiction to being a wee little bitch. We can see these collective public blame games demonstrated on social media on a consistent basis. Being a victim is not exclusive to any demographic, ideological, religious, or ethnic group. Quote, in fact, this may be the first time in human history that every single demographic group has felt unfairly victimized simultaneously, and they're all riding the highs of the moral indignation that comes along with it. The mainstream, as well as a large portion of even the alternative media as well, releases a steady stream of what Ryan Holiday calls outrage porn, instead of addressing issues that actually matter, which explains why things seem so divisive and polarizing. This perception of moral certainty causes us a great deal of suffering and isolation. Psychologist Roy Baumeister wanted to know why people do really shitty, sadistic things. Originally, he thought that they did evil, shitty things because they lack self-esteem. However, he found the opposite, that people who do terrible things feel pretty fucking good about themselves. Take the Stanford prison experiment, for example, where volunteers were both guards and prisoners, and the prisoners were treated so terribly that they had to cancel the experiment. Examine what happens in real prisons, in the US of course. In Sweden, they give people skills to actually function in society after their sentence. Many of us are capable of asking ourselves if we are wrong. The more difficult part, however, is admitting what it would mean if we are wrong. This is because the ramifications of being wrong are quite painful to face. As Aristotle once wrote, quote, it is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. Does admitting you are wrong create a better or worse outcome? Typically, we don't admit we are wrong because this is emotionally difficult to do. Quote, if it feels like you versus the world, chances are it's really just you versus yourself. As millennials and Zoomers, we've grown up in a society surrounded by authority figures that Dan Pena would call weenies. We are told to treat everyone with dignity, respect, kindness, and condemn intolerance, bullying, non-inclusion. We must be intolerant of intolerance at all costs. If you do any of those things mentioned, you are a terrible, shitty person, and you should be canceled. Despite the fact that we've heard this dogma drilled into our ears, it does not conform to reality. In reality, rejection is a necessary part of our everyday existence. To reject something means that you value something else in its place. To choose anything means that you've rejected other choices. One of the cons of the digital age is that people don't have to confront people and be straight with them. The downside of having friends on a screen instead of in real life is that if someone has a problem with you, they can just ghost you. No need for conflict or rejection. We can just have these nebulous pseudo-relationships where no one puts any effort into anything. Or we can accept confrontation as a necessary part of maintaining relationships. This is where boundaries come into play. When you see an influx of chicks posting about boundaries on their story, this means that a wave of fuckboys have wreaked havoc on their psyches while you were fucking your hand. So what are boundaries? Boundaries. Alright, I'll lay off the Counter-Strike style headshot effect. But just one more time. Boundaries. Boundaries are where one person ends and another begins. In a perfectly healthy relationship of two healthy individuals, be it platonic, business, romantic, or otherwise, both accept responsibility for their values. When the value becomes pleasing or controlling the other person's behavior, this isn't healthy. Relying on another person for your happiness is a recipe for misery. We can't control other people. Paradoxically, solving your problems and adopting responsibility will increase the quality of your relationships. Quote, "You both should support each other, but only because you choose to and be supported, not because you feel obligated or entitled." Thus, the belief that you can fix someone doesn't work. For instance, there is the shit test that women have asked their fellas for Buddha knows how long. The "does this make my butt look big?" shit test, to which most men reply, "You look fine," because they don't want to hurt their partner's feelings. Manson, on the other hand, because he is based and wrote the greatest fucking book on dating of all time, would tell her how he really felt that she looked. Sometimes this causes conflict, but because Manson values honesty, and his wife does as well. Consider how many metaphorical fat asses in a dress we deal with in our daily lives. All the times that we fear speaking what we really think because we fear conflict. Tell the truth, but also be tactful in the delivery, bucko. I'd like to wrap up with a few takeaways. In Robert Greene's Laws of Human Nature, we learn that just because we may think we are right when dealing with other people does not necessarily mean that we can logically convince them of our position. We must carefully observe and acknowledge their values to more effectively solve problems and create value. We can implement this by being precise in our words, speaking less, and listening more. In subtle art, we learn to value what is important, and to do that we must decide what is not. Although it is tempting to consider ourselves a victim, it has the danger of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. The world may be as it is, but how we respond to it is a choice. Most important of all, we have learned that there are in fact alternatives to smacking a motherfucker in the face. Thank you for watching. That concludes today's video. If you find our videos valuable, consider becoming a patron, link at the end. Be sure to hit subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. And a way that you can support the work that we do on this channel is by copying the link and sending it to a friend to whom you think would find value from the content discussed. I'm Parker Tebow for Focus Shift Media, and that's a wrap on today's video. Hope all is well.